a grip of drought that is intensifying in the West has led scientists to turn to an unusual ally in the fight to limit the effects of climate change.
Environmental groups were furious when Florida decided to relocate hundreds of beavers to a barren wasteland with zero vegetation. They called it animal cruelty and a massive waste of taxpayer dollars compared to the $87 million official restoration plan. The project was supposed to take 30 years to show any real results, but the beavers did not want to wait that long.
Without the beaver dam in this area, what would this be like right now?
This would be bone dry and sandy, which is what it was before the beavers moved in.
Within just a few years, they reversed decades of man-made damage using only mud and sticks. Basically, these animals did what 100 scientists and millions of dollars could not do, and the results are truly staggering. Nature reclaims the dead zone. In the year 2018, the state of Florida made a choice that many people thought was completely out of touch with reality. They gathered 328 beavers from areas where there were too many of them and moved them to the Panhandle. The target was 15,000 acres of land that was essentially a ghost of its former self. This area was located near the Ecological River, a place that used to be a beautiful mix of cypress swamps and hardwood forests. In the 1950s, big companies moved in and decided they wanted to turn the wetlands into farms. They dug miles and miles of deep ditches to drain the water away, and it worked way too well. The water table dropped 15 feet, and the rich soil that had been underwater for centuries began to dry out and rot. This released huge amounts of carbon into the air and made the dirt so acidic that crops could not survive for more than 20 years. By the 1980s, the corporations gave up and left the land to die. You could walk for miles and not see a single tree. It was just a flat, hot, and dusty plain of hard clay and invasive grass. During the rainy season, water would rush through the straight ditches and go right into the river without ever soaking into the ground. During the dry season, it was like a desert. No birds, no frogs, and no fish could live there. Florida owned nearly 15,000 acres of this nature-related dead zone, and it was costing them money just to keep it empty. Fixing it the normal way was going to cost $87 million and take over 30 years. That is when a scientist named Dr. Sarah Martinez stepped in with a plan that sounded like it came from a fairy tale. She wanted to let the beavers do the work for almost no money. She knew that beavers are not just animals that live in water, but they are nature's best builders. Even without trees, she believed they would find a way to survive and change the land. She asked for $680,000 to move the beavers and watch them for 2 years. Compared to $87 million, it was basically free. The state said yes, but the public was not happy. People thought the beavers would perish from the heat because there was no shade. In August of 2018, the first beavers were let go in 47 different spots across the wasteland. They stood on the cracked clay, looked around at the empty horizon, and started to move. The first few months were a total mess, and it looked like the critics were right about everything. Some people even whisper that this land was not just abandoned farmland, but a site for secret government testing that made the soil toxic on purpose. If that were true, the beavers were not just fighting dry dirt, but a chemical wall that should have ended them instantly. The local ranchers were ready to say, "I told you so," as the beavers wandered aimlessly. What most people don't realize is that the hardest part of the journey was just about to begin for these animals. Nature struggles to find a foothold. Aerial surveys taken in September of 2018 showed that 40% of the beavers had already left the release sites. They were moving through the hot sun looking for a better place to live, and some were even found dead. The ones that stayed did not have any wood to build with, so they tried to use mud and tall grass to block the drainage ditches. These early dams were tiny and weak, barely reaching 2 feet high. Whenever it rained, the water would move so fast through the straight ditches that it would simply wash the dams away. The beavers would spend all night working, only to see their hard work gone by morning. Local news stations ran stories calling the project a massive failure and a waste of money. They showed pictures of the pathetic mud piles and it seemed like the experiment was over before it even started. But as the dry season hit Florida between November and February, the Beavers changed their strategy. They realized that the drainage ditches were like highways for water, and they could not stop the flow there. Instead, they started looking for the low spots in the land where water would naturally sit after a rainstorm. They began to build their dams in these hollows, away from the fast-moving water in the ditches. They used whatever they could find, like old sticks from miles away and thick clumps of invasive weeds. These dams were not pretty, but they were smart. They were built to hold on to every single drop of rain that fell from the sky. In December of 2018, a big storm hit the Panhandle, and the small dams actually held. The tiny puddles that were only 30 feet wide in October started to grow until they were 200 feet across. Because the dams were deep, the water did not evaporate as fast in the sun. This standing water was the key to everything. Deep in the dry soil, seeds from the original wetland plants had been sleeping for over 40 years. Once they felt the water, they started to wake up. By February of 2019, researchers found small patches of green growing around the beaver ponds. There were rushes and sedges and even tiny willow trees starting to poke through the mud. The beavers finally had something to eat that was close to home. They did not eat everything, though. They were very picky and only cut what they needed, which actually helped the plants grow back even stronger. By the time March rolled around, the beaver population had stopped dropping and was starting to settle in. There were 47 family groups that had claimed their territory and were ready for the next phase. Some biologists started to wonder if these beavers were communicating in a way we don't understand. Perhaps using a subsurface vibration to coordinate their dam locations across miles of empty land. It was almost as if they were following a master plan that no human had given them. Everyone's obsessed with the end result, but the middle of the story is where the magic really starts to happen. Hidden blueprints of the wild. When the spring rains of 2019 arrived, the beavers were ready with their improved dams. The ponds that were small a few months ago started to expand until some were 1/4 of a mile wide. The beavers kept adding more mud and more sticks to the walls, making them taller and thicker every single day. A dam that was only 3 feet tall in January was suddenly 7 feet tall by May. As the water backed up, the different ponds started to join together. One big colony, which the scientists called the Alpha Group, built a dam that was 450 feet long. This created a 14-acre pond that stayed full even during the hottest part of the summer. This huge body of water did something that no machine could ever do. It pushed water back into the dry ground for hundreds of yards in every direction. The hard clay soil, which had been like brick for decades, started to get soft and wet again. The deep drainage, ditches that were supposed to carry water away, were now blocked by beaver dams, causing the water to spread out horizontally across the flats. By July of 2019, the view from space showed bright green circles covering 30% of the land near the ponds. The plants were not just grass anymore. There were willows reaching 15 feet high and thick bushes called wax myrtles. Even cypress trees, which everyone thought were gone forever from that area, started to grow from the old seeds in the dirt. The beavers now had real wood to use for their dams, and they stopped using just mud and grass. They wove the willow branches together to create structures that were incredibly strong. These dams could handle a flood without moving an inch. As the plants grew thicker, the animals started to come back in numbers that no one expected. Bird experts found 47 different types of birds in the new wetlands by the end of 2019. Big white egrets and blue herons were standing in the shallow water, hunting for the fish that had somehow found their way into the ponds. Even ducks began to stop there during their long flights south for the winter. But the most surprising thing was the frogs. Before the beavers arrived, there were almost zero frogs in the area because it was too dry. Just 1 year later, there were thousands of them from 8 different species, making so much noise at night that you could hear them from a mile away. Wild theories began to circulate that the beavers were actually bringing fish eggs in their fur from distant rivers, acting as intentional transporters of life to speed up the process. If they were truly doing this on purpose, it would mean beavers have a level of intelligence that would shock the world. Things get even crazier when you realize that this was only the beginning of a much larger chain reaction. Engineering a living masterpiece. The evolution of the landscape was no longer a slow crawl but a biological explosion, a testament to the sheer resilience of nature when given a proper foothold. The original 47 colonies, once fragile groups of pioneers clinging to a desolate landscape, had undergone a massive expansion, splitting and diversifying into 83 distinct family units. This was not merely a change in statistics, it was a fundamental shift in the regional identity. There were now more beavers living on this land than the number that had been originally released by the conservation teams years prior. This singular fact served as the ultimate proof of the project's success. It meant the beavers were not just surviving the harsh conditions of the Florida interior. They were thriving, raising healthy kits, and claiming new territory with every passing season. This realization marked a monumental turning point in the history of the restoration effort, because it proved the project could now sustain itself indefinitely. The need for human intervention, supplemental feeding, or heavy-handed management had evaporated. The beavers were no longer starting from nothing, scratching out a living in a hostile environment. They had become the architects of their own world, and their primary job now was simply the maintenance of the vast, sprawling infrastructure they had already built. The physical transformation of the land was nothing short of miraculous. The vegetation had grown so thick and lush that even in the dead of winter, when the rest of the Florida scrub might look parched or dormant, the beavers had access to an endless buffet of willow, aquatic plants, and hardwood bark. The dead zone was a term that no longer applied to this territory. Satellite imagery captured in 2022 provided the hard evidence that the skeptics had long demanded. The data showed that over 6,000 acres of what was once considered a biological wasteland were now fully functional, vibrant wetlands. To put that into perspective, that represented 42% of the entire property, a massive chunk of land that had been reclaimed from the grip of erosion and drought. While the area had not yet returned to the towering ancient majesty of the forests that defined the region back in the 1950s, it had achieved something perhaps even more important. It had become a working ecosystem. This new landscape was actively filtering pollutants from the water, trapping silt that would have otherwise choked downstream rivers, and significantly cooling the local air through the massive amount of moisture being released into the atmosphere. At the heart of this transformation was the Alpha Colony's pond, which had defied all expectations by growing into a massive 78-acre lake. It was a body of water so significant that it began to develop its own internal currents and ecosystems. The main dam, a masterpiece of natural engineering, held back millions of gallons of water, creating a pressure that pushed moisture deep into the surrounding earth. This single structure kept the ground saturated for miles in every direction, acting like a giant sponge that refused to let the land go dry even during the most intense heat waves. The old barren clay that had once cracked under the sun was gone, buried under layers of rich organic silt, and replaced by thick, impenetrable marshes. In these new wetlands, the plants grew with a prehistoric ferocity, often reaching heights of 12 feet or more, creating a green wall that provided cover for a secret world of wildlife. Even the alligators, the undisputed kings of the Florida swamps, recognized the change. They began to migrate into the deep, cool ponds created by the beavers, carving out their own territories in the shadows of the beaver lodges. It was a strange and powerful symbiosis. The beavers built the habitat, and the alligators provided the security, their presence keeping other smaller predators from becoming too bold. As the water stabilized, other species began to realize that the dead zone was alive once more. River otters, ever the opportunists, followed the beaver-engineered waterways inland. They could be seen sliding down the muddy banks and playing in the new clear streams that formed in the overflow between the various dams. These otters were the scouts of a larger migration. Bobcats soon followed, their silent forms prowling the edges of the water where the thick brush met the marsh. They were drawn by the explosion of life at the bottom of the food chain. The new greenery had created a paradise for rabbits, mice, and voles, which multiplied in the safety of the dense cover. For the government agencies that had initially authorized the project, the most compelling evidence of success was not just the return of the bobcats or the height of the reeds, but the cold, hard numbers on the balance sheet. Back in 2018, the land had been valued at $0 in terms of environmental or economic contribution. It was a liability, a place where rain ran off the hard clay and caused flooding downstream while offering nothing in return. But by 2022, the metrics had shifted dramatically. Economists and environmental scientists calculated that these new wetlands were providing over $4 million worth of ecological services every single year. The beavers were preventing costly floods by capturing and holding on to torrential rains, cleaning the local groundwater by acting as a natural filtration system, and trapping immense amounts of carbon within the deep, wet soil. They were doing the work of the atmosphere and the waterboard simultaneously. The most incredible part was the efficiency. The state had spent only a tiny fraction of the budget that would have been required for a traditional, man-made civil engineering project. The Beavers had performed the labor equivalent of 1,000 construction workers equipped with heavy machinery, and they had done it without a single contract, a single delay, or a single bill sent to the taxpayers. As the project entered this new era of maturity, a sort of local mythology began to grow around the beavers of this specific region. Locals and researchers alike started to notice behaviors that seemed almost too coordinated to be accidental. Legends began to circulate that these beavers had developed a unique and sophisticated social structure unlike any seen in the wild before. Observers claimed they saw the beavers working in organized shifts, with some groups maintaining the dams while others appeared to be patrolling the outer boundaries of the wetlands, like a tiny, furry army. They seemed to possess an uncanny understanding of the landscape's history, specifically the human-made ditches that had been dug decades ago to drain the land for failed agricultural projects. With what appeared to be military precision, the beavers targeted these old drainage systems, plugging them with a mixture of mud and heavy logs to break the old infrastructure and force the water back onto the land where it belonged. They were not just building homes, they were systematically dismantling the mistakes of the past, reclaiming the earth one ditch at a time, and ensuring that their new kingdom would remain wet, wild, and impenetrable for generations to come. So, here's the deal regarding the future of how we look at the damaged parts of our world. Global echoes of the beaver boom. Scientists from all over the globe started flying into the Florida Panhandle to see if the rumors were actually true. They arrived in waves, filling the small regional airports and clogging the dusty back roads of a county that was more accustomed to timber trucks than international research teams. These men and women came from Tokyo, London, Berlin, and Rio de Janeiro, carrying expensive sensors, core samplers, and drone arrays, all driven by a singular desperate hope that the reports of a miracle in the marsh were more than just anecdotal hyperbole. They expected to find a modest ecological recovery, perhaps a few patches of green in the gray. But what they found was something that changed the rules of how we fix nature. Traditionally, the field of conservation has been a slow, methodical, and often frustrating endeavor. For decades, the consensus was that we had to fix the water and the plants first, before we could even dream of bringing the animals back. We acted like cautious interior designers, meticulously scrubbing the floors and painting the walls of an ecosystem before daring to invite the inhabitants home. Florida did it the opposite way. In an act of what many initially called scientific recklessness, they put the animals in a dead place and let them create the right conditions themselves. This shift in strategy is now called rewilding, and it is rapidly becoming the hottest topic in global science, sparking heated debates in lecture halls and environmental agencies alike. The core of the Florida miracle lay in a simple, biological feedback loop. The beavers, introduced to a landscape that looked more like a moonscape than a wetland, did not wait for the environment to become hospitable. They forced it to be. They created a loop where every good thing led to another good thing, a self-reinforcing engine of restoration that outperformed any human-led initiative in history. The process began with the dams. These weren't just piles of sticks, they were sophisticated filtration systems. The dams trapped the mud and the toxic silt that had been washing off the industrial sites for years. Instead of flowing downstream to choke the estuaries, the mud settled, creating pockets of rich, anaerobic soil. This soil, thick with captured organic matter, became the perfect nursery for dormant seeds that had been buried for decades. The soil grew plants, and the plants, vibrant, nitrogen-fixing species, fed the beavers. With a stable food source and a growing territory, the beavers built more dams, and the cycle started all over again, expanding outward like a green ripple in a stagnant pond. By 2024, the data coming out of the Panhandle was so staggering that many researchers initially thought their instruments were malfunctioning. The soil near the ponds had 340% more nutrients than it did when the project started. This wasn't just a marginal improvement, it was a total chemical overhaul of the land. Phosphorus and nitrogen levels, which had been depleted by years of industrial runoff and erosion, were being naturally sequestered and cycled through the new biomass. Perhaps even more impressively, the water table was almost back to where it was in the 1930s, before the big companies moved in, straightened the rivers, and ruined the natural hydrology of the region. The beavers had effectively reversed 70 years of human-driven damage in just 6 years. They had managed to undo a lifetime of ecological negligence with nothing but their teeth and an innate understanding of fluid dynamics. The success in Florida has sent shockwaves through the international community, leading other countries to try to replicate the Panhandle Protocol. In 2023, the United Kingdom, a nation that has historically struggled with devastating seasonal flooding, started releasing beavers onto old, soggy farms. The goal was to see if these natural engineers could slow the flow of water upstream to stop the catastrophic flooding in nearby downstream towns. The results there are already showing promise, as the beaver-made wetlands act like giant sponges, soaking up the deluges that used to turn village high streets into rivers. Even Australia, a continent famous for its caution regarding introduced species, is looking into using beavers to fix their dried-up riverbeds. The debate there is fierce, given that Australia does not have native beavers, but the desperation to heal their parched interior is beginning to outweigh the traditional fear of ecological interference. Researchers are closely watching the Florida model to see if the benefits of hydration and soil health can be achieved without disrupting the local balance of flora and fauna. Even in China, government officials and environmentalists are studying the Florida project with intense scrutiny. They are looking to see if these methods can be adapted to save their own disappearing wetlands along the Yangtze and Yellow rivers. The global consensus is shifting toward a humbling realization. It turns out that beavers are better at being engineers than humans are. Unlike human crews, beavers never stop working. They don't take weekends off, they don't go on strike, and perhaps most importantly, they don't need a permit or a 10-year environmental impact study to move a log. They respond to the immediate needs of the land with a level of efficiency and persistence that no government agency could ever hope to match. Today, if you were to walk through those 15,000 acres in the Florida Panhandle, you would never know it was once a dusty, silent wasteland of cracked clay and skeletal trees. The transformation is sensory and total. You will see cypress trees 20 feet tall, their feathery needles of vibrant neon green against the blue Florida sky. You will hear the constant melodic sound of water rushing over giant structures of wood and mud, a sound that had been absent from this landscape for nearly a century. The air itself feels different, heavier, cooler, and filled with the scent of damp earth and blooming lilies. The center of this new world is the Great Dam. The biggest structure in the complex is now 12 feet tall and 600 feet long. It is a masterpiece of nature, a sprawling, tangled fortress that holds back millions of gallons of water. To build a similar structure using concrete and steel, the state would have had to spend millions of dollars in engineering fees, materials, and labor. The Beavers did it for free, using the very debris that humans had left behind. The project is now considered basically finished, though not because the humans have checked off all the boxes on a list. It is finished because the Beavers are in charge now. The role of the Florida wildlife officials has shifted from active restoration to mere observation. The state only spends about $40,000 a year now, a pittance compared to the original budget, just to keep an eye on things and ensure the perimeter remains undisturbed. But the truth is, the Beavers don't need the help. They are doing exactly what they were born to do, managing the landscape with a wisdom that predates human civilization. They have created a self-sustaining Eden that requires no maintenance from the species that originally broke it. However, as the dust settles and the green canopy thickens, a final unsettling mystery remains that has the scientific community buzzing. Some researchers, performing routine genetic monitoring, have found that the beavers in this specific area have slightly different DNA than the original population they started with. It is as if the toxic land, with its unique cocktail of industrial chemicals and heavy metals, forced them to evolve at a speed that should be biologically impossible. Usually, evolution is measured in millennia, but here, it seems to be happening in the span of a few generations. Their teeth are harder, their digestive systems are more robust, and their immune markers suggest an incredible resistance to the pollutants that once made this land a graveyard. This discovery has led to a radical theory that is currently making its way through the upper echelons of biology. Could these beavers be a new kind of superorganism? Could they be a version of the species that has been switched on by the very destruction we caused, designed by nature as a sort of emergency response team to heal the planet? The implications are profound. If nature has a built-in mechanism to accelerate evolution in response to human catastrophe, it changes our entire understanding of the relationship between the built environment and the wild. It suggests that the planet isn't just a passive victim of our progress, but a reactive, intelligent system that is capable of producing the tools it needs to survive us. Hands down, this is the most important lesson nature has ever taught us about fixing our own mistakes. We spent decades trying to command the earth to heal, but it wasn't until we stepped back and let a humble, flat-tailed rodent take the lead that we finally saw what true restoration looks like. The Florida Panhandle is no longer a monument to industrial failure. It is a living laboratory of hope, proving that even the most broken places can be made whole again, if we are brave enough to trust the architects who were here long before we were. What if the secret to saving the planet is not more technology, but just getting out of the way of the animals that were here first? Do you think we should trust nature to fix our biggest messes? Tell us what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this amazing transformation, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories from the wild.